G'day and welcome back to the rant. Now if you've clicked on this video because you want to see a helicopter crash, well, sorry, this isn't a clickbait. There's no video footage of a helicopter crashing. I will be talking about a helicopter crash a little later in the video, but basically, to give you a quick intro, there was a helicopter with a pilot and an instructor and a student on board. They saw a drone and you won't believe what happened next. That's as close as I get to clickbait anyway. First of all, I want to talk about one of the original names in the hobby, one of the longest standing names in the hobby is going out of business. They're shutting up shop. They're saying, no more, we've had enough. And I'm talking about solar film. Solar film and Solartex are two products that are made by a company that really was one of the very first to make these heat shrink covering films. And I remember back in probably the very late 70s, or before the late 70s, before solar film came along, when you wanted to build a model, you found a suitable tree, balsa wood preferably, you chopped it down, you milled it up into strips and things, you laid the strips out on a plan which had wax paper on it so that the glue didn't stick to the plan itself. You glued it all up with a balsa cement, which was a really horrible brittle glue that stuck to your fingers and you spent hours picking the remnants off. And then once you'd built your structure, you would then put tissue on it, or nylon or silk or some kind of covering, and then you would put dope on that to shrink it so that it was tight, and then you would paint it. And of course it was a long-winded process. It was expensive because all these different, the silk, for example, you go and price some silk today, really expensive, but I covered a lot of models in silk when I was younger. And then dope's expensive too, man. I cannot believe the price of a tin of dope these days. And then you've got to paint it, and you've got to use the minimum of paint so you don't add too much weight and so many factors. It was really, finishing a model would take as long as building a model. And then solar film came along and said, well, we got a solution for you guys. And they developed this sheet of plastic film, which when you heated it, it would shrink. And not only was it a plastic film, but they put a pigment on it so you could have whole lots of different colors. And then they put a heat-sensitive adhesive on the back. So now, instead of all that, putting dope and paint and all that sort of stuff, you just built your aeroplane structure out of the wood of your choice. You laid this plastic film over it after peeling the backing off first. We've all made that mistake. You laid your plastic film over it. You used an iron to seal around the edges so it activated the glue and stuck all around the edges of the area you're covering. Then you would just crank the iron up a little bit and run it over the wing or whatever it was, and all the film would shrink tight like a drum, and it would look beautiful, shiny, glossy. You couldn't scratch it because the pigment was under the plastic film. It was fantastic. It was fuel-proof. It was relatively durable. It was easy to repair. It had all the things we wanted when we wanted to create a nice model. Wonderful. So naturally, by the middle of the 80s, every man and his dog was using heat shrink covering film to finish their models. You'd be silly not to. And a lot of other companies started up. There was Monocoat, you had Orocover, Orocoat, Tough Coat. Just about every manufacturer, every distributor in the business had their own brand of this heat shrink covering film for models. So it was a roaring trade, roaring business. And solar film were one of the very first, if not the first. I can't remember whether they came first or Monocoat, but it was one of the two. And so they did a good business for quite a long time, but the hobby has changed. The hobby has changed. When I started, there was no such thing as an ARF. There was no such thing as a bind and fly or a plug and fly or a ready to fly. Nope, they would just, you bought your wood and you bought a plan and you built it yourself. These days, of course, well, not many people actually go to the whole process of buying and selecting timber, balsa wood, pinning it to a plan, adding glue, building it all up and then covering it themselves. So the demand for covering film has fallen immensely because these days the vast majority of models are made of foam. You don't need covering film on foam. You may use lamb film if you've got a foamy and you want to toughen it up a bit, but the average model, no, it comes ready finished. So you don't need this heat shrink covering film, which meant companies like Solar Film have noticed a massive downturn in sales, and Solar Film have now come out and said, well, we're just not selling enough to make it worthwhile, so we're going to stop production. Okay, that's a sound business decision. It's going to be a shame to see another one of the iconic brands in the hobby disappear, but hey, change means progress. Progress generally means things are better. I mean, I would not go back to having to build every model I fly if you paid me money. I much prefer to fly than to build, so I love the way things have changed. But if you want a piece of history, if you want to be able to show your grandchildren what solar film looked like, you better go and buy a roll now, because once it's gone, it's gone. There'll be no more stock. And so there you go. Just another way that the hobby's changing. Right, let's talk about that helicopter crash. In America, South Carolina, a Robinson R22 helicopter crashed, and the news stories all over the internet are saying the crash was caused by a drone. No, the drone didn't collide with the helicopter. It didn't touch it in any way, shape or form. And the reports seem to vary a little depending on which ones you read. I read one report that said the helicopter was hovering over trees and the drone was seen by the student and the instructor, and in the process of trying to avoid the drone, they crashed into the trees. Another report I read said that the helicopter was actually hovering over a deserted area, and again, they saw a drone, and in the process of trying to avoid the drone, they clipped a bush and crashed. The helicopter was completely written off, by the way. So typical with these stories, nobody seems to know exactly what happened, and we have to say this is just third party, this is second-hand information. I wasn't there, you weren't there, the reporters on the paper weren't there. We're just having to go off what the instructor and the student have told us. That brings up a very important issue. Now, they say they saw a drone. In fact, one report I read that specifically said it was a Phantom 4. And I've got to say, yeah, it's starting to smell already, because I am quite familiar with the DJI product lineup. I can't tell a Phantom 4 from a Phantom 3 unless I get really close. You know, I have to actually hold up my hands to see the difference. They're very, very similar. And even a Phantom 2 or a Phantom 1 from a distance, they all look the same. So how did they know it was a Phantom 4? How did, you know, really seriously, while they're busy trying to avoid it and implement sort of, you know, wild maneuvers that eventually resulted in the crash, they had the clearness of thought to actually decide it was a Phantom 4 and not a 3, 2 or a 1? Yeah, something smells there. And if we look at the history of these reports of drones and incidents with aircraft, manned aircraft, I have no reason to believe that it perhaps wasn't a drone. It may have been a shopping bag, perhaps, because they've been mistaken for drones before. Perhaps it was a fruit bat, because they've been mistaken for drones before. And maybe it was just, I don't know, someone on the ground with ground handling, because that's been mistaken for drones before. In fact, so many of the reports we get from manned aviation that claim they've had an incident with a drone have later been found to be something completely different or nothing at all. We had the airliner coming into, I think it was Gatwick Airport, reported a collision with a drone, turned out to be one of those shopping bags. We had an aircraft, I think it was in Australia, that reported a collision with a drone, turned out to be a fruit bat. And we've had an airliner in Africa reported a collision with a drone that stoved in the radar dome, turned out just to be a structural failure. So yeah, I'm sorry, when you cry wolf that often, then credibility, nah, it's way down there. I'm sorry, I cannot believe that this was actually a drone, because there's no substantiating evidence. There's no impact with the helicopter. There's no one else who saw this whole thing happen. And interestingly enough, DJI log all the data. We know this, that all the data, and they've been instrumental. I think the guy who hit the military helicopter in New York was nabbed. One of the reasons he was nabbed was because DJI had information on the flight of that helicopter, of that drone, because it was all going back through the telemetry. So no such information has come from DJI in respect to this helicopter crash. But we know from the pilot's own account that it was a Phantom 4. So that information should have gone back to DJI. If it was as they said, they should already know who this person was. But no, we don't seem to have any of that coming back. So I'm going to paint a little picture for you. Here's how it goes. We have a pilot or an instructor and a student practicing hovering in an area a long way from an airfield. Now, the closest airport, I think, is the, Charleston or whatever it is, it's, International Airport, and that is over 5 miles away, right? So the drone pilot, so the helicopter instructor and student are hovering in a fairly deserted area with a few little shrubs and bushes, doing some hovering practice. So the student really is right down there at the bottom of the learning curve. You have to learn to hover before you can do anything else. So he's learning the very first basic maneuver, which is hovering. I wouldn't be surprised if he's doing that, something goes wrong, the instructor is a bit slow to catch it, and crash bang wallop, the helicopter tips over, balls itself up, and there they are sitting in a cockpit counting their bruises at the end of this catastrophic failure. So what do? My goodness, the instructor, he's in trouble because he didn't do his job properly. The student, well, perhaps he's in trouble because he didn't follow the instructor's orders or advice. So both of them are sitting there thinking, how do we get out of this problem? We're going to get the blame for trashing this helicopter, and they're worth $180,000 or $200,000. Oh my God. The easiest way out? Let's say it was down to a drone. Let's say we saw a drone, had to take evasive action and crashed. The evil drone did this. Yeah, I have a very strong suspicion. I can't substantiate it because, as I say, I wasn't there. But it just smells. I think perhaps that may be what happened. Let's blame it on a drone. But yeah, I don't know what you think. But really, I'm afraid manned aviation has cried wolf far too often for me to take this seriously. But this does raise some very interesting questions. Let's assume there was a drone involved, even though I don't think there was. Let's assume there was a drone involved. Now, who's at fault in this situation? Now, I've looked on Google Earth. Looks like none of the newspapers bothered to do this because they're only interested in the clickbait headlines and the fake news. Looked on Google Earth. This Daniel Island is well over 5 miles away from the nearest airport, which is the Charleston International Airport or something. Anyway, I got on Google Earth and I drew one of those ruler lines between the edge of the international airport and the closest part of the Daniel Island. It's over 5 miles. So if there was a drone operator there, he didn't have to call the airport. And he was following FAA regulations and recommendations by flying more than 5 miles from an airport, right? So he was doing the right thing. Then we look at the other thing, that this helicopter apparently was 15 meters or 50 feet above the ground when it saw the drone coming into its airspace. So the drone pilot was only 55 feet above the ground. He wasn't above 400 feet. He was, again, following the recommendations, the requirements under the regulations of the FAA to fly his drone. He was more than 5 miles from an airport. He was flying well below 400 feet. So he was doing all the right stuff. Also, this was supposedly a deserted area, so he wasn't flying near people or cars or buildings. He was doing everything by the book. So who's wrong here? Well, I don't know, but I'm not sure of the rules in America, but here in New Zealand, the regulations require that if you're in a manned aircraft, you must fly above 500 feet, except when taking off or landing, or when operating in a designated low-flying area. Now, this area, as far as I can tell, on Daniel Island, is not a designated low-flying area for manned aircraft. And since the guy was doing a hovering practice, he wasn't coming in for a landing or a takeoff. He was hovering, admits, practicing hovering, right? So he had no good reason to be below 500 feet. The drone operator was doing everything right. The helicopter instructor and student were not. They were doing bad things. They were operating under 500 feet when they shouldn't be. But, you know, they thought they were doing it in a deserted area, which probably was a good idea. But this is where, if the people follow the rules with drones, that's exactly where drones are going to be found. If you've got the law-abiding drone operator, he's going to be away from people, away from cars, away from airports, below 400 feet, exactly where that helicopter was. So who's at fault? Well, unfortunately, the way regulations are currently written, it's always going to be the drone operator, because he must give way to manned aircraft. Now, this is where there's a grey area too. The pilot or the instructor in the helicopter simply said that the DJI Phantom 4 was headed for their airspace. What the hell does that mean? How far away was it? And how fast was it coming? Was there actually any threat? I mean, there's nothing that says you can't fly a drone in proximity to a manned aircraft. There's nothing that says, there's no minimum distance in regulation. As long as it is safe, you're allowed to do it. And of course, one assumes that the only time you're going to get close to a manned aircraft when you are flying 5 miles from an airfield is if you're flying above 400 feet. But no, in this case, he may have been close and he was at 15 meters, 50 feet. So this is where the regulations are just broken down completely because, and this is the reason, because as things stand, the burden is falling on the shoulders of drone operators. The regulatory burden falls on our shoulders. We are the ones who must make all the changes to accommodate manned aviation. And that's got to change. It has to change. Now that there are more drones than manned aircraft, now there are more registered drone owners and operators than people with pilot's licenses, now there are more drone flights every day than manned aircraft flights, the manned aviation community is going to have to realize they have to start making some changes. Can't just say it's all down to drones. You guys have to make some changes. Regulators have to appreciate that if you want to protect manned aviation, you're going to have to start restricting where they can fly, because in some areas the risks may be unacceptable, even if the drone operators are following all the rules, as would appear to be the case in this instance. Drone operator was doing everything right. The helicopter pilot was doing everything wrong. He may legally have been entitled to go down that low, but if you're instructing somebody, if you've got a student with you, the last thing they need is a distraction. So why would you operate in an area where there could quite legitimately be drones? Why didn't you do it at the airport why don't you go 6 or 7 miles away to the airport and do it in an area there where you can hover safely, and you know that if the drone operators are following the rules, you will never find a drone there. Instead, you choose somewhere where there's a very high likelihood of there being a drone if the drone operator is following the rules. It makes no sense. Yet, in this case, the drone operator would always be at fault. No, I'm sorry, FAA, CAA, CASA, Transport Canada, you guys are going to have to start saying, to protect pilots, we must start restricting where they can operate with respect to the risks posed by law-abiding, legitimate drone operators, because they have a right to use the airspace as well. One thing I'll say for our CAA in New Zealand is they say that unmanned aviation has every much as much right to use the airspace as manned aviation. That's one of the brilliant things they've said, and it's so true. It's so true. So you have to start according rights to the unmanned aviation, and you have to start restricting what the manned aviators can do, because it's too dangerous for them to do some stuff. It's just too dangerous for them to do what they did in this case. Don't believe me? If it wasn't too dangerous, why have we got a completely destroyed R22 helicopter somewhere? Proves it's dangerous. Irrefutable proof. If it wasn't dangerous, that wouldn't have happened, would it? Unless there wasn't a drone involved. Food for thought. Anyway, that's my little opinion on that incident. And so, another day, another non-event in respect to drones and manned aircraft. So there you go. I'm sure there are plenty of full-size manned aviators who have been watching these vlogs, and I'd like you to chime in. What do you think? Is it time that you guys started accepting that you don't own the sky? If you want to stay safe, if you want to stay alive, you've got to start appreciating that some places, like below 400 feet, more than 5 miles out from an airport, it's too dangerous. Too dangerous for you. You cannot guarantee there won't be some law-abiding drone operator who's going to ruin your day. So maybe those rules in regards to how low you can fly need to be changed or more rigidly enforced. And what do you think? And if you fly drones or model aircraft, what do you think? Should we have some right to some exclusive right to airspace? Some exclusive right to airspace to ensure safety of everybody? I think it's time we did. I think the 400 feet and below should become our airspace, just as above 500 feet is manned airspace. We don't have a right to fly above 500 feet. If we fly above 500 feet, we get in trouble. So why can't manned aviation get in trouble if they fly below 400 feet without good reason? And by good reason, I mean taking off or landing, or operating in an area designated for such activities. And when a helicopter is just doing hovering practice, regardless of whether it's legal, it's still not taking off or landing. So it doesn't qualify under what I've suggested and what I think is in force here in New Zealand. There you go. That's it. So join in the discussion. Have your say. Vent your spleen. Have your own little mini rant in the comments. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like it, give it a thumbs down. If you can't make your mind up, there's a wonderful PewDiePie video that I will probably link in the description for those who don't care. And thank you to my Patreon supporters, because thanks to you, everybody only gets to see one ad on this video, and that's always got to be good. So that's it. I don't think I've got anything else to say. Oh yeah, I do actually. This is the 4th take for this rant. Oh man, we've just seen the arse end of a ex-tropical cyclone. So when I tried to make this video yesterday, the first time, the audio was completely screwed because the rain noise was too much. You couldn't hear me over the rain noise, okay? So then I went home and did it, and I got photobombed by the cat. Look at this. There you go. And also, there was still too much rain noise in the background, even at home. Then I tried to make it last night, and for some reason, the camera just stopped. So this is the 4th try. Hopefully this is a good one. Anyway, there you go. See you again soon. Bye for now.